They said our grandfather abandoned us. For 12 years, my sister and I believed it. We carried that story the way you carry a stone in your shoe, always there, always pressing, never quite letting you forget it was there. We were told he was a man who walked away from his family without looking back. A coward. A ghost who chose to disappear rather than face the people who needed him. For 12 years, that story was the foundation of everything I understood about myself, about where I came from, about what kind of blood ran through my veins. Then I stood in the darkness of a cave on the side of a mountain in Montana, holding a letter written in the shaking hand of an old man who had died alone, and I understood that the foundation had been a lie. Every brick of it, every single word. My name is Callum Carter. I was 18 years old when the state of Ohio decided it was finished with me. And this is the story of what I found when I stopped listening to what other people told me was worthless. The morning of my 18th birthday smelled like every other morning at the Riverside group home. Industrial soap, powdered eggs, the faint chemical bite of floors mopped too many times with water that had not been changed often enough. That smell had soaked into the walls and the carpets and the plastic chairs and probably into me too after 3 years of breathing it every single day. I'd been waking up to that smell since I was 15, since our last foster placement collapsed the way they always did, quietly, without explanation, with a phone call to the caseworker and a single garbage bag handed to each of us on a Tuesday morning. Before that, it was another house. Before that, another. 9 houses in 12 years. 9 different kitchens and 9 different sets of rules and 9 different ways of making 2 children understand they were temporary, that they were guests who had overstayed, that they were problems being managed rather than people being loved. March 17th was different, though. March 17th was the day the system would finally release its grip on me. I had been counting down to it for 2 years, the way some kids count down to summer. Not because I had anywhere to go, not because I had a plan or money or anyone waiting for me on the other side, but because 18 meant the door was open. 18 meant I could at least choose which direction to walk. I sat in the hard plastic chair outside Mrs. Caldwell's office at 10 minutes to 9. The chair was the kind that had been designed with institutional durability in mind and human comfort as an afterthought. I had sat in chairs like it my entire life, in waiting rooms, in courtrooms, in school offices where people read my file before they looked at my face. My sister Wren sat beside me. She was 15 years old, thin, and coiled like a spring, her dark hair pulled back tight. She had been picking at a loose thread on the cuff of her sweater since breakfast, working it back and forth until a small hole had opened near her wrist. She did not look at me. I did not look at her. We did not talk about what today meant because talking about it would have made it real in a way that neither of us was ready for yet. Mrs. Caldwell's door opened at exactly 9 o'clock. She was a woman in her early 50s with gray, threading through dark hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead like she had forgotten they were there. She had been our caseworker for the last 2 years, which made her the longest-serving person in either of our lives who was paid to keep track of us. That was not saying much, but she was not unkind. In a system that ground people down, she had at least tried to remain a person. "Come in," she said, "both of you." Her office was the same as it had always been. Metal desk, filing cabinet with a dented lower corner, motivational posters starting to peel at the top left edge. The room smelled like stale coffee and old paper, the official scent of a life administered by strangers. Wren and I took the 2 chairs facing the desk. Mrs. Caldwell shuffled through a stack of papers with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times. She would not meet my eyes right away. That was never a good sign. "Happy birthday, Callum," she said finally. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Just the ripple, and then quiet. "Thanks." She slid a folder across the desk. "Release paperwork, final placement report, transitional housing contacts, 90 days to establish stable housing." Her voice was professional and measured the tone of someone reading from a script they had memorized years ago. I had heard variations of this speech in other offices from other workers in other cities. The details changed. The tone never did. But the real weight in the room was not about me. It never had been, not really. The real weight was sitting beside me, picking at the hole in her sleeve. "What about Wren?" I said. Mrs. Caldwell took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. Ren stays in the system until she turns 18. That's the law, Callum, you know that. Under the desk, Ren's hand found mine. Her fingers were ice cold. We had survived 9 foster homes together, 9 houses with 9 different sets of rules and 9 different ways of reminding us we did not belong. We had made a promise to each other once in the darkness of a shared bedroom in a stranger's house during a thunderstorm, when we were both too old to be scared of weather but scared of it anyway. We would never be separated. We would never leave each other behind. It was the kind of promise you make when you have nothing else to offer the person you love most. The system was about to break it for us. There has to be something, I said. Some way I can keep her with me. Mrs. Caldwell sighed. There is one option. If you can demonstrate stable housing and verifiable income within 60 days, you can petition for legal guardianship. But Callum, she leaned forward. Her voice softened into something that might have been kindness or might have been pity. The two feel very similar when you have never had much of either. Be realistic. You have $25. You have no credit history, no permanent address. The chances of establishing guardianship in 60 days, or she did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. I felt Ren's grip tighten. I could feel her trembling. In that barely there way, she had the vibration running through her hand like a current trying to find somewhere to go. She had not cried since she was 11 years old. The year the Aldersons sent us back because we were in the official language of the report too difficult to integrate. The year Ren made a decision, I watched her make in real time a decision to lock something away, to stop showing the world anything it could use against her. She had kept that decision for 4 years, but I could feel it now, the pressure of everything she was holding back. There was one other thing, Mrs. Caldwell said. She reached under her desk and produced a small cardboard box, the kind that might have once held a pair of shoes. It was sealed with tape so old it had turned the color of old bone. My name was written on the top in faded black marker, the letters slightly uneven. This was held in trust for you until your 18th birthday. It came from your grandfather's estate. The word hit me somewhere below the chest. Grandfather. Silas Carter, a man who had existed in my life only as a story and not a good one. He had vanished the year I turned 5, a year before the car accident that killed our parents and delivered Ren and me into the machinery of the foster care system. Every adult who had ever mentioned him had used the same words. He walked away. He chose to disappear. He left his family without looking back. I had grown up with that story as a fixed point, a fact of the world. The kind of truth you stop questioning because questioning it leads nowhere good. I thought he didn't have anything, I said. He didn't have much. Mrs. Caldwell pressed her finger to a specific document in the stack. This is a property deed. He left you 5 acres of land in Ridgecrest County, Montana, a place called Stone Mill. For one wild, impossible moment, something flared in my chest. Land, property, a place. She held up her hand before I could say anything. Before you build any ideas around this, you need to understand what it is. The county lists the parcel as unimproved and non-arable. It's essentially a section of mountain rock and timber and a cave. No road access to speak of, no water infrastructure, no electricity. The property taxes have been paid from a small trust, but that trust is now depleted. The flare died, left cold ash behind. However, she continued sliding another document forward. This one was on expensive letterhead, the kind of paper that announces its own importance before you read a single word. There is a standing offer. A company called Blackstone Mining Corporation has been attempting to acquire surrounding parcels in that area for several years. They are prepared to offer you $5,000 for the property, $5,000. I had 25. To me, in that chair in that office, $5,000 was a different category of number altogether. It was bus tickets and deposit money and rent and time, the one resource I did not have enough of. Mrs. Caldwell looked at me with something approaching warmth. They need an answer by the end of next week. Honestly, Callum, take it. It's a gift. It's more than that land is worth. I stared at the box on the desk, at my name written in handwriting I did not recognize. From somewhere deep and quiet, I caught the ghost of a smell, sawdust and machine oil, and something older than both. A fragment of memory too small to hold. Big hands, a low voice humming something. The feeling of being lifted and set on a broad shoulder and seeing the world from high up. That was all I had of him. Fragments. Why do they want it, I asked. If it's worthless, Mrs. Caldwell shrugged in the way of someone who has learned not to ask too many questions. Gravel deposits, maybe? They own all the surrounding land. Your piece is just a gap in their map. But something had snagged. Something small and persistent, the way a loose thread will catch on a rough surface and hold. If the land was truly worthless, just rocks and a cave on the side of a mountain nobody visited, why had this corporation been pursuing it for years? Why had their lawyers been calling, according to Mrs. Caldwell's notes, with increasing frequency over the past 18 months? Why was the offer $5,000 when surely an operation the size of Blackstone could fill any gap in their map for far less than that? I need to see it first, I said. The words came out before I had decided to say them. Wren looked at me. Her eyes went wide for just a moment. Mrs. Caldwell shook her head slowly. Callum, it's a 2-day bus ride. That's money you don't have. The smart decision here is to sign the papers, take the check, and put yourself in a position to actually pursue guardianship. Going on a trip to look at a pile of rocks is, I know, I said. I'm going anyway. She looked at me for a long moment. The professional composure shifted very slightly, and I saw something underneath it. Not pity this time. Something closer to recognition. The look of someone who has watched a lot of people to sit in those 2 chairs and make choices and has learned which ones will be remembered. All right, she said. It's your decision. Just understand that the clock is running from today. I stood up. I picked up the cardboard box. It was heavier than I had expected. I know, I said again. The clock's been running my whole life. The Greyhound station smelled like diesel and old coffee and the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from waiting. I bought 1 ticket to Stone Mill, Montana, $43. I walked out of the window with $4 and some change and the cardboard box under my arm and the understanding that I had just made either the most important decision of my life or the most reckless one. Those are often the same decision. I said goodbye to Wren that morning at the group home. She stood in the doorway while I shouldered my bag, her jaw set in that particular way she had, chin slightly forward, eyes flat, every soft thing locked away behind a wall she had been building since she was 11. She nodded when I said I would call. She nodded when I said I would figure something out. She did not cry. She never cried. I was 3 hours into the first leg of the trip, somewhere out in the flat, open, nothing of central Ohio, watching the landscape go gray and brown through the smeared window, when I heard a sound from the seat directly behind me. A familiar cough. I turned around. Wren was crouched in the gap between seats, her backpack clutched to her chest like a life preserver. Her eyes meeting mine with a look that I had learned years ago meant she had already decided and was simply waiting for me to catch up. I pulled her into the seat beside me. What are you doing? I said. My voice was low and controlled in the way of someone working hard to keep it that way. We made a promise. Wren, if they find out you left without authorization, they'll what? She lifted her chin. Put me in another group home. She shook her head. I've been in 7 different houses since I was 3. 7 families that didn't want me. You are the only person who has ever stayed, Callum. So no, I'm not letting you leave me behind. I wanted to be angry. Some rational part of me understood that I should turn this bus around, get her back before anyone noticed, before she caught a charge that would follow her through the system until she aged out at 18. The practical part of my brain was running through the consequences in quick, unhappy detail. But I looked at her, at this girl who had decided at age 11 that the world did not deserve to see her cry. At this girl who had just thrown away every safety she had to follow me onto a bus to Montana because we had made a promise in the dark. And I could not do it. Okay, I said. We stay together. Always. She leaned her head against my shoulder. Her breathing slowed almost immediately. And after a moment, in a voice so quiet I almost missed it, she said, we have each other. That's more than we've ever had. The journey took 2 days. We watched America change through grimy windows. Ohio gave way to Indiana. Indiana opened into Illinois. The flatlands of the Midwest rolled on forever under a sky that was always one shade or another of gray, and then the land began to wrinkle, and then buckle, and then rise. Illinois became Iowa, became South Dakota, and the Dakotas lifted into something that finally looked like the edge of the world. We ate granola bars and shared the last of the water I had packed and took turns sleeping against each other's shoulders, while the bus emptied out at each stop until it was just us and an old man near the front who smelled of pipe tobacco and the long-distance sadness of someone traveling alone. Wren slept badly. She jerked awake at every stop, every application of the brakes, every time the bus slowed to turn. Each time she reached for me in the dark to confirm I was still there. She was 15 years old and she still expected people to disappear while she slept. That fact lived in my chest like a splinter too deep to reach. The bus pulled into Stone Mill at 4:15 on a gray Thursday afternoon. The town was not what either of us had imagined, though in truth, neither of us had been imagining anything very specific. It was a wide spot in a two-lane mountain road, a gas station with a sign that had not been updated since a decade that predated both of us. A hardware store? A diner with a neon open sign in the window flickering with the uncertainty of something that might give out at any moment. A row of houses with the particular quality of structures that have been settled into by time paint, faded porches slightly bowed, the whole arrangement suggesting a community that had been exhaling slowly for a generation. Cold mountain air hit us when the bus door opened, clean and sharp in a way that city air never was carrying, and wet stone and something older and nameless underneath. The bus driver looked at us with the expression of a man who had seen enough poor decisions in his time to recognize one when it climbed off his bus. The door hissed shut behind us. The bus pulled away. And we were alone in a town that did not know us on a street that went quiet very quickly after the diesel engine faded. "Is this it?" Wren said. Her voice was small in a way it almost never was. "This is it." We walked into the general store. A bell above the door chimed a cheerful sound at odds with everything else. The man behind the counter was old, maybe mid-70s, with a face shaped by decades of high-altitude wind and the particular kind of patience that comes from watching the same mountains every day and learning not to ask them questions they aren't going to answer. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless, and they moved between us with the careful, neutral assessment of someone accustomed to reading people quickly and accurately. "Help you," he said. I unfolded the property deed on the counter. "I'm looking for a piece of land. Parcel 734. The old Carter property." The man's eyes dropped to the document, then back up to me. Something shifted in the pale gray, a flicker of recognition, deep and private. "Carter," he said slowly, as if the word had weight he was testing. "Haven't heard that name in a while. You relation?" "He was our grandfather," I said. The man looked at me for a long time, then at Wren, then back at me. He was reading something in our faces that we could not read ourselves. Whatever he found there, it was enough to make a decision. He introduced himself as Harlan Wicks, 74 years old, had been running this store for a long time, had been a lot of things before that 20 years of military service, not something he elaborated on, just a fact he stated the way you state facts about weather, had been in Stone Mill since before Wren and I had been born. He pulled a scrap of paper from under the counter and drew a rough map in pencil. Main road north about 3 miles. Logging trail on the left overgrown, now mostly just a suggestion in the brush. Follow it up as far as you can drive or walk. After that, you go on foot. He sold us 2 bottles of water and a bag of granola bars. Wren was looking at a rack of candy bars with eyes that were trying hard to be casual about it, so I bought her one too, even though I was now down to my last $2. As we were heading for the door, Harlan called after us. His voice had dropped, not quite to a whisper, but close. "Watch out for the people from Blackstone Mining. They've been circling that land for years now, sending men up, asking questions." He paused. The kind of questions people only ask when they already know part of the answer and want to know the rest before anyone else finds it. "What do they want with it?" I asked. Harlan's jaw tightened. Something moved behind those pale gray eyes, something old and complicated. That was not quite fear, but was in the same neighborhood. That, he said, is a very good question. The logging trail was barely a trail. It was more of a suggestion, a scar in the mountainside where trees had once been dragged through, now so thoroughly reclaimed by brush and fallen timber, and root systems heaved up by years of freeze and thaw, that it was a harder walk than any actual trail would have been. Thorns caught at our clothing. Exposed roots waited for inattentive feet. The air thinned perceptibly as we climbed, and our breathing adjusted to it, without our permission, the way the body always adapts to what it has to adapt to. I took Wren's backpack without asking when I heard her breathing start to go ragged. She opened her mouth to object, and I kept walking without meeting her eyes, and after a moment, she let it go. We had our own language after 12 years. The meaning of certain silences, certain movements, certain looks. We had built that language together the way you build anything in the dark, by feel, by necessity, by the discovery of what holds and what does not. The sun was dropping toward the ridge when the trail widened into a small clearing, and I saw it for the first time. A wall of rock, dark gray and ancient, rising out of the tree line like something that had been standing since before anything else existed on this part of the earth. The cliff face went up and up into the low cloud that had moved in from the west, its top edge lost in white. Millions of years of weather had cut and shaped it into something that looked almost intentional, almost deliberate, as if it had been placed there by hands too large to imagine. At the base of the cliff, slightly left of center, was the cave entrance. A dark opening that swallowed my flashlight beam after only a few feet breathing cold air out into the fading afternoon. And to the left of the clearing, a structure. Low and weathered, its wood gone gray with decades of mountain weather. The roof bowed in the center under the weight of years. A single window on the near wall. A door facing us slightly irregular in its frame. This was it. This was the inheritance. This was what my grandfather had left us. Wren stood beside me. She did not say anything for a long time. The wind moved through the pines at the clearing's edge with a sound like breathing. Somewhere far behind the mountains, something moved in the brush and then was still. Rocks, she finally said, in a falling down shed, in a hole. Yeah, everybody was right. I was already walking toward the shed. I did not have an answer for her because there was nothing wrong with what she had said. Everybody had been right about what was here, a chunk of worthless mountain. The question I could not answer yet was whether worthless was the same thing as without value, and whether those two things were as identical as everyone seemed to assume. The door was padlocked, heavy iron, the kind built to last, and there was something wrong with it, or rather something right about it that should have been wrong. The lock was old. The metal had the patina of decades of exposure, but the mechanism was smooth. The pivot point moved without resistance when I touched it. The surface of the iron where the shackle met the body was faintly bright, recently wiped, recently oiled. Not last year, not last month, recently. I pulled out the iron key from the cardboard box. It had been sitting in a government office for 13 years, waiting for me to turn 18. I held it for a moment before I tried it, feeling the weight of it, the temperature of it. Then I slid it into the lock. It fit. The lock opened with a low grinding sound, metal on metal, that had not spoken to each other in a while but remembered the conversation. The door swung inward on hinges that groaned like something waking up slow and reluctant from a long sleep. And then the smell hit me. Sawdust. Machine oil. Something underneath both of those. Something organic and warm and entirely specific. A smell that carried no visual memory with it, but something deeper and more stubborn than visual memory. The memory that lives in the body rather than the mind. The kind that bypasses reasoning entirely and lands somewhere older. I knew that smell. I had not encountered it since I was 5 years old. I could not have described it to anyone or located it in any catalog of sense. But I knew it the way you know your own heartbeat, not by thinking about it, but by simple, undeniable recognition. It was the smell of my grandfather. Wren, I said, look, the inside of the shed was not the ruin its exterior had promised. It was organized, maintained. It was the interior of a workspace belonging to someone who cared about order, who understood that good work required good tools and good tools required care. Hammers and chisels and handsaws hung from wooden pegs in carefully graduated rows, largest to smallest, each in its place. Coils of rope and climbing gear were looped over iron hooks set into the ceiling beam. The workbench along the far wall was solid and square, and had been built, you could see at a glance, to outlast everything around it. Everything was clean. Not dusty clean, the way abandoned things get when they're simply left alone long enough. Actually clean, maintained, attended to. Someone had been here, not years ago, recently. In the center of the workbench sat a metal box, army green, the size of a shoebox, with the look of something that had been made to survive conditions most things didn't. It was locked with the same type of heavy iron mechanism as the door. My key fit this one too. My hands were shaking when I lifted the lid. I was not aware of deciding to shake. It simply happened some communication between the deepest part of what I knew and the outer world I was standing in. Inside on a cloth that had once been white and had yellowed with age, arranged with the care of someone who had thought about this moment for a long time. A brass compass. The real kind, heavy beveled edges, a needle that swung with the deliberate authority of something calibrated to the actual earth. A stack of photographs bound with a length of string that had gone gray and soft. The top photograph showed a man I did not recognize, standing in front of a stone wall that was only half built, his hand resting on the top course, looking at the camera with an expression of quiet satisfaction. He was maybe 50. His hands were large and rough with work. His eyes were steady, and a thick envelope sealed with red wax pressed with what looked like a thumbprint. On the front, in handwriting that was precise but trembled slightly at the ends of strokes, the handwriting of someone older, writing with care rather than ease, two names: Callum, Wren. I looked at my sister. In the failing light coming through the shed's single window, her face was pale and still. She was looking at the envelope with an expression I had no category for. Something between awe and fear. Something that did not have a word yet. "This means something," she said. "Yes." She took the envelope from my hands and held it, and I let her hold it because some things need a moment before they can be opened. Some doors need to be approached slowly. Some letters have been waiting long enough that a few more seconds don't change anything. I broke the seal. Inside was a letter, not a note, a letter. Pages and pages of that same careful, trembling script, dense and deliberate, the writing of a man who had thought about every word before he put it down. I counted the pages, 7 of them written on both sides. "My dearest grandchildren," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have come of age, and somehow, through whatever combination of stubbornness and luck, and something I can only call fate, you have found your way to this mountain. I hope the years have been kind to you. I know they probably haven't, and I need you to understand the truth about why I left. Because what you were told was not the truth. It was never the truth. I did not abandon you. I never abandoned you. Not for a single day of the 12 years that followed. I was forced to disappear, and I disappeared so that you could live." We sat on the cold floor of the shed, Wren and I, our backs against the workbench, reading by flashlight as the night came down over the mountain. The letter was long and detailed and written in the voice of a man who had been alone with these words for years and was finally at last allowing them to go somewhere. Silas Carter had been the best stonemason in Ridgecrest County. That was not modesty or self-promotion. It was simply what people knew about him, what the county's buildings and foundations and walls had been saying for decades, without needing anyone to translate. He had grown up in Stone Mill, the son of a stonemason, the grandson of one before that. Stone was the family language. Aldrich Voss had grown up on the same road. 2 houses down, 3 houses down, close enough that Silas could not remember a time when he had not known Aldrich's face. They had run together through these same mountain valleys as boys. They had worked their first jobs on the same crew. They had, in the unsentimental way of men who grow up doing hard physical work side by side, loved each other in the way that does not always get called love, but is. And then money had come into it, or rather the desire for money that was too large to come through legitimate means. Aldrich Voss had built something in the years when Silas was raising a family and building a reputation. He had built a structure of influence and fear that reached into every corner of Ridgecrest County and beyond. Judges, law enforcement, politicians who found that certain campaign contributions came with certain expectations attached. A network of small crimes that fed larger ones, that fed the kind of operation that runs on silence and intimidation and the very reliable human tendency to look away from things that are profitable to ignore. And what Aldrich had needed at a certain point was someone who could build the physical infrastructure of secrecy. Hidden rooms, concealed vaults, chambers that could not be found by anyone who did not know they were there. Architecture of disappearance. The work of someone who understood stone, who understood how it could be shaped and moved and fitted so perfectly that even its seams were invisible. "Your grandfather," the letter said. "He was the only man in 3 states who could do what I needed done. And he was the only man I trusted." That was the mistake I made, not trusting him. Trusting the idea that I was still the kind of man who deserved his trust in return. When Silas's son, our father, had accumulated a debt to Aldrich's organization that he could not repay, Aldrich had come to Silas with a proposal, not a request. A proposal, which is what powerful men call the things that are not actually optional. Work for me, the proposal went. Build what I need built. Keep my secrets in stone where no one will find them. And in exchange, your son lives. His family, his children, remain untouched. You will disappear. You will let everyone believe you walked away. You will give up everything. And in exchange, I will give you what you actually want, which is the safety of the people you love most. Silas had agreed. I could feel Wren beside me reading the same lines I was reading. I could feel the change in her breathing, the quality of her stillness, the way a person goes quiet when something they have held for a long time begins to shift. He did not leave us, she said. Her voice was a sound I had never heard from her before. Something cracked open in it, something that had been sealed for 4 years. No, I said. My own voice was doing something that I did not have good control over. He didn't. We read the rest of the letter together. The instructions at the end were precise and detailed and written in the voice of a craftsman, a man who understood that good directions are not general, that they specify that they account for the variables. The cave, the main chamber, 3 stone pillars that descended from the ceiling like enormous fingers pointing at the earth. The middle pillar, the compass, face north, 20 paces, trust the work. And then the last lines, the men who want this land are Aldrich's sons and their sons after them. They know I built something here. An old partner told them, someone I had trusted who decided that loyalty was worth less than self-preservation. They do not know what I built. They know only that something is here, something worth having, something their father wanted and never got. They have been trying to buy this land for years. They will offer money. They will offer more money. When that fails, they will stop offering. Do not sell. What I left you is worth more than anything they could put a number on. Trust my work, trust my hands, and know that I have loved you every day of every year that I have been unable to say so. Your grandfather, Silas. I folded the letter and put it in my shirt pocket against my chest. My hands were steady. The shaking had stopped. Something had settled in me, not peace exactly, but certainty. The cold, unargued certainty of a thing that has been decided. We were not going to sell. The night air outside the shed was sharp and full of stars that were not visible anywhere I had lived before. I had not known there were that many stars. The mountain above us was a dark shape against the sky, patient and enormous, and entirely indifferent to the 2 young people standing at its base, turning over a truth that had been buried for 12 years. Then headlights, coming up the logging trail, slow and deliberate, cutting through the dark in twin beams. A black SUV entered the clearing and stopped. Its engine ticked over quietly for a moment, and then 2 doors opened. The man who stepped out first was in his late 50s. Expensive coat, hair the color of old silver, groomed and in place despite the mountain and the dark and the cold. His face had the particular quality of a man who had spent decades being agreed with a kind of settled authority, an assumption of compliance so deep it had become structural. He moved without hurry. He had a smile prepared before he even reached us. The second man was younger, 30 or so, harder featured. The expensive coat on him did not fit the same way it fit the first man. It looked like costume rather than clothing, like something put on over something else that was the true nature of the man wearing it. His eyes moved around the clearing with a quick, assessing energy that did not stop moving even when it landed on us. Callum Carter, the older man said. His voice was smooth in a way that reminded me of the surface of still water, presentable, reflective, hiding whatever was underneath. I'm Prescott Voss. This is my nephew Brecken. We represent Blackstone Mining Corporation. I put Wren behind me. Not theatrically, just moved so that I was between her and them the way you move your body. When your body understands something, your mind is still working out. I know who you are, I said. Prescott's smile widened by a fraction. Then you know we've made a very generous offer on this property. $5,000 for a piece of land that has no practical use. More than fair, most people would say. The answer is no. Brecken shifted his weight. His hands at his sides opened and closed once. Prescott raised a hand slightly, a gesture so small it was almost invisible. But Brecken went still. The gesture of a man who had been giving commands long enough that they had been reduced to minimum motion. I understand this land has sentimental value, Prescott said. Your grandfather spent a great deal of time here, I believe. So let me offer something more appropriate to the circumstances. $50,000. Cash. You take your sister somewhere comfortable. You start over. You forget this mountain ever existed. $50,000. It was in the purest practical terms enough to change everything. Stable housing petitioned guardianship time and buffer and the ability to build something real. It was more money than I had ever been within a mile of. It was the answer to the specific problem I had been trying to solve for years. I looked at Prescott Voss. I looked at the shape of his face, the set of his jaw, the particular quality of his patience, the patience of someone who expected to get what he wanted and was simply waiting for the correct number to emerge. I thought about a man named Aldrich who had grown up 2 houses down from my grandfather and learned stone from him, and then used that learning to build a house of crime that eventually cost Silas Carter 12 years of isolation and the chance to watch his grandchildren grow up. The answer is still no, I said. Something moved in Prescott's eyes. Something he did not quite put away fast enough. It was there for only a moment, a contraction, a hardness, and then the smile was back, and his voice was the same smooth surface it had been. Brecken had moved closer without either of us noticing it happen. He was close enough now that I could see his face in detail. Young, well-dressed, the kind of person who had learned at some point that cruelty was available to him without consequence and had organized himself around that discovery. "You think you're something," he said. His voice was quiet and conversational in the specific way of someone who has learned that quiet is more frightening than loud. 2 foster kids with nothing. No family. No one on earth who would notice if something happened to you up here on a mountain nobody visits. I heard Wren make a small sound behind me, a sound she could not fully suppress, a sound that came from the place she kept everything she refused to show. I did not step back. "This is Carterland," I said. "My grandfather bled for it. He gave up everything he had for it. And you think I'm going to hand it over to the people who are the reason he had to give all of that up in the first place? You can burn every building on this mountain, and I'll still be standing here when the smoke clears." Brecken's face changed. His right hand came up. Prescott's voice stopped him. 2 syllables, his nephew's name delivered with the flat authority of a man who understood that certain actions created problems that other actions couldn't solve. "Not here. Not tonight." Brecken's hand came back down, but his eyes made a promise that his voice was not saying. Prescott straightened his coat. He looked at me with an expression that had passed beyond anything as simple as anger into something colder and more considered. "You have until the end of the week to reconsider," he said. "After that, mountain living can be unpredictable. Accidents happen. It would be a shame for 2 young people to come all this way and find the situation had become more complicated than they anticipated." They walked back to the SUV, both doors closed. The engine turned over and the headlights swept the clearing, and then they were gone, the sound of the engine fading down the mountain until the forest absorbed it completely. I stood in the dark and the quiet and the cold air, and I did not move until I was certain the sound was gone. Wren's hand found mine. Her fingers were trembling. "Callum," she whispered, "what are we going to do?" I did not have an answer yet. What I had was a letter folded against my heart. The key that had opened 2 locks that had been waiting 13 years for me. The knowledge of what my grandfather had given up and why he had given it up and for whom. What I had was the certainty, cold and clear and unshakable as the stone above us, that we were exactly where we were supposed to be. The question of what it would cost to stay there was one I would have to answer later. The stars were brilliant overhead, more than I had ever seen, more than I had known existed. The mountain was dark and enormous and patient. Far below us, the lights of Stone Mill were a faint, scattered warm in the black distance. We went back inside the shed. We pulled the door closed behind us. We wrapped ourselves in the blankets we had found and sat against the workbench with the flashlight burning between us and the brass compass on the floor and the photographs spread out face up around us like a map of a life we were only beginning to understand. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. The mountain breathed. Somewhere under our feet, through 200 feet of ancient stone, a door was waiting. A room was waiting, and in that room the evidence of a man who had loved us every single day that we had believed he was gone. We did not know any of that yet, but we were not leaving. We slept badly that first night. The wind came down off the ridge sometime after midnight and worked at the shed walls with a persistence that made sleep feel like something that was happening to other people in other places. Every creak of the old wood brought me upright. Every shift in the darkness made my hand reach for the flashlight before my eyes were fully open. Wren slept in short stretches, her breathing uneven. Her body coiled even in sleep with the readiness of someone who had learned very young that the night was not always safe. At some point before dawn, the wind died. The mountain went completely quiet. Not the absence of sound, something more deliberate than that. The quality of silence that belongs to high places, to stone and old timber and deep cold. A silence that has been there since before anything made noise and will be there long after everything stops. I lay on my back in the dark and listened to it. In my shirt pocket, folded against my chest, Silas Carter's letter was still warm from my body heat. I had read it 4 times. I could have recited most of it from memory by then, but I kept returning to the same passage near the end, the instructions specific and technical, and written in the voice of a man who understood that the difference between a direction that works and one that doesn't is the difference between sufficient detail and not enough. 3 pillars, main chamber, stand at the base of the middle one from one. Face north 20 paces, trust the work, trust my hands. Dawn came the way it comes in the mountains. Not gradually the way city light builds, but in a sudden shift, the world going from black to deep blue to the cold gray of early morning in the time it took the sun to clear the eastern ridge. I was already up when it happened, already standing in the clearing with the brass compass open in my palm, watching the needle find its bearing. Wren came out of the shed a few minutes later. Her hair was loose, which was unusual for her. She kept it back tight most of the time, contained the same way she kept most things contained. She looked at me, and then at the cave entrance, and then at me again. Today, she said. Today, I said. She pulled her hair back and tied it, picked up her flashlight from where she had set it on the shed step. Checked the batteries, set her jaw in that particular way. We stepped into the darkness together. The entrance tunnel was narrow, barely wider than my shoulders, and the ceiling dropped low enough in the first 20 feet that we both had to duck. The rock on either side was rough and cold and damp, beaded with moisture that caught our flashlight beams and threw them back fragmented. The air changed the moment we were inside the mountain. Cold was different from the outside cold. Denser odor, carrying the specific weight of underground spaces, the smell of stone that has never been warm. Then the tunnel opened. It did not open gradually. It opened all at once, one step. We were in the narrow passage, and the next step the walls were gone, and the ceiling was somewhere far above us in the dark, and we were standing at the edge of something vast. My flashlight swept the space and found almost nothing. The far wall was beyond the reach of the beam. The ceiling was lost completely in the black above. The floor spread out ahead of us, uneven and wet, crusted with formations that glittered. Where the light found them, pale crusts of mineral deposits, small stalagmites growing up from the stone and clusters formations that had been accumulating at the rate of a cubic inch per century for longer than anyone had been around to measure it. Wren made a sound beside me. Not a word, just a sound. I moved the flashlight slowly. The beam crossed flowstone curtains hanging from an unseen ceiling, translucent, where the light caught them just right, rippling like frozen fabric. It crossed clusters of crystals growing from the wall in tight formations that threw the light back in points and fragments, like a section of night sky had been pressed into the stone. It crossed formations I had no names for, shapes that had no equivalents in the world above ground. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It was the most beautiful thing I understood in that moment that most people would never see. This chamber had been sitting here in perfect, absolute darkness since before humans existed, growing its crystals and its curtains and its forests of stone, in total silence, accountable to no one, requiring nothing. It did not know it was beautiful. It did not know anything. It simply was in the deep, patient way that stone is. My grandfather had found it, had come to this mountain with nowhere else to go, and had walked into this darkness and had found this. Wren reached out and took my arm without looking at me. She was still turning her flashlight slowly across the walls. The 3 pillars were on the far side of the chamber, which meant crossing the floor and navigating around formations that had taken centuries to build and could be damaged or destroyed in a moment of inattention. We moved carefully, single file, each foot placed with deliberate care. The floor was slick, in places dry in others, the surface constantly changing beneath us. We did not talk. There was nothing to say that the space around us was not already saying better. The pillars were massive. Each one descended from the ceiling like a stalactite that had grown long enough and fat enough to become something more than a stalactite, something structural, something that looked intentional, even though nothing about it was. They were irregular and textured and ranged in color from pale gray to deep amber, where minerals had leached into them over time. They pointed at the floor like enormous fingers, like hands reaching down. Ren said softly, her voice absorbed immediately by all that surrounding stone. I stood at the base of the middle pillar. The stone was cold under my palm. I opened the compass. The needle swung and steadied. I turned my body until I was facing due north. 20 paces, I said. Count with me. Our footsteps echoed in the vast space, each one returning to us from multiple directions at slightly different times, a disorienting multiplication of sound. 1, 2, 3. The flashlight showed nothing ahead but more cave floor, more formations, more uneven stone in every direction. 4, 5, 6, 7, halfway, 8, 9, 10, 11. Ren's grip on my arm tightened. 12, 13, 14, 15. Nothing, just rock, just cave. 16, 17, 18. I could hear my own heartbeat. The cave was so quiet that it amplified everything. 19, 20. I stopped. In front of us was a wall of rock indistinguishable from any other wall in the chamber. No seam, no crack, no visual evidence that anything had ever been done here by human hands. Just stone, rough and continuous and ancient. I stood there for a moment, held the compass in my right hand, thought about the letter. Thought about a man in his 50s, alone on a mountain, working in darkness, building something with the most precise tools he had, the tools he had been using his whole professional life. Building a door that no one would recognize as a door. Building a room that no one would know was there. Trust my hands. I put my palm flat against the wall and began to move it slowly. Quarter circle from the center. Quarter circle back. Up 6 inches. The same arc. The rock was rough and cold, and entirely consistent bumps and ridges, and the small pits of mineral variation that covered every surface in here, the ordinary face of stone that had never been touched. Then I found it, an indentation, smooth at its edges unlike the natural roughness around it, no bigger than the pad of my thumb, perfectly circular, pressed into the rock at a height that corresponded to the natural reach of a hand placed palm first against the wall. I pressed it. Nothing happened. The cave was silent except for the distant, irregular drip of water. Somewhere deep in the dark, a sound that had been going on since long before we arrived and would continue long after we left. I pressed harder. From somewhere inside the rock, from somewhere behind and below at a distance that was impossible to judge, I heard it. A sound that had no business existing inside solid stone. Low and grinding mechanical, the sound of components engaging that had been built to wait exactly this long. A series of clicks ascending in pitch. The sound of a lock opening that had been waiting 13 years for the right key. And a section of the wall moved. Not dramatically, not with force or speed. A fraction of an inch inward, a hairline gap appearing at its edges, perfectly straight, perfectly uniform, the geometry of something manufactured rather than formed. The gap was invisible until you knew to look for it. Now that I knew it was all I could see, I found the edge with my fingertips and pulled. The door was extraordinary. 500 pounds of solid stone, minimum dressed and fitted and counterbalanced, with a precision that defied what I thought I understood about what a person could build alone in the dark over years. It moved on its hinges with a smoothness that felt engineered, that spoke of tolerances and calculations, and the specific knowledge of how stone behaves under sustained load and over time. My grandfather had built this door in a cave in the dark alone over years. He had built it to last. Beyond the doorway was not another section of cave. It was a room. I stepped through. The ceiling was low enough to touch if I raised my hand. The walls were smooth, not polished, not finished in any decorative sense, but dressed, worked, shaped by tools guided by a craftsman who understood exactly what he was doing. The floor was level, which was the most remarkable thing about it, because making a floor level in solid rock is a different order of difficulty from everything else. The room was roughly the size of a shipping container. Along the left wall, a wooden bed frame narrow built into the rock, its platform a single wide plank that had been shaped and sanded smooth. Folded on the platform was a wool blanket gray worn thin at the edges, tucked with a neatness that spoke of habit and long practice. Against the far wall, shelves carved directly into the rock held stacked cans and folded clothing and tools, arranged with the same care as the tools in the shed above. A small desk built from the same material as the bedwood that had been carried up a mountain piece by piece and assembled here in the dark sat beneath the only decorative element in the room, a shelf of books. 15 or 20 of them, spines turned out their covers, worn with repeated handling. On the desk, a kerosene lamp. When I lifted it, I could feel the oil moving inside. This was not a hiding place. This was a home. My grandfather had not fled to this mountain and waited out the years in a survival crouch. He had built himself a life here, a small life constrained and solitary and hidden from everything and everyone he had ever known, but a life. He had made his bed every morning. He had read his books by lamplight. He had maintained his tools and organized his shelves and kept his floor level and lived here in this room in the heart of a mountain for 10 years. Wren walked to the desk. Her hand trailed along the surface of the wood slowly, the way you touch something you are trying to understand through contact. The surface was smooth with years of use, the particular smoothness of wood that has had human hands on it repeatedly, that has absorbed the oil and warmth of skin over a long time. He sat here, she said. Her voice was very quiet, and the stone gave it back to her from 3 directions at once. He read these books. He slept in that bed. He was right here, Callum. All those years we thought he left us. He was right here. I picked up the book on top of the stack. A collection of poetry, its spine cracked from being opened at the same place many times. Inside the front cover, in my grandfather's handwriting, for the nights when the silence is too heavy. I set it down carefully. On the desk beside the lamp there was one more envelope, smaller than the first unsealed, sitting in the center of the desk's surface, as though it had been placed there with intention and left. I opened it. A single sheet of paper, a small key. If you found this, the note read, "You were brave enough. I am proud of you both. Look behind the bed. Third stone from the bottom left side. The key fits what's inside." And then a paragraph that changed the temperature of the room. "The men who want this land know I built something here." An old partner told them, someone who chose his own safety over loyalty. They don't know what. They know only that something exists and that it is worth having. When they learn you've refused to sell, they will not stop at words. They will come here. Be careful. Be brave. And do not lose the notebook. Wren found the stone before I did. She was already at the side of the bed, her fingers working along the lower courses of the wall, counting. Third from the bottom, left side. The stone was fitted as precisely as everything else in this room. You could not see the join until you knew it was there, and then you could feel it, the faintest line of deliberate space between this stone and its neighbors. It came out smoothly. Behind it was a cavity in the rock roughly the size of a shoebox, and inside the cavity was a metal box that was smaller than the one upstairs but heavier. I used the small key. The lid opened. Money. More money than I had ever been close to, more than I had ever thought of as a real number that could exist in proximity to my life. Stacks of bills and rubber bands, 50s and 100s, crisp and clean and orderly. I did not count it. I looked at it for a moment and then set it aside. Beneath the money was a notebook. Leather-covered dark brown, the leather worn soft and supple from years of handling. I opened it. The first pages were dense with technical drawings, blueprints, elevation sketches, cross-sections. The draftsmanship was exceptional, precise lines in careful notations, the work of someone who thought spatially and could translate that thinking onto paper with the same fluency a musician uses to write down a melody. Hidden rooms, concealed vaults, passages built into the foundations of buildings that their owners did not know about. Each drawing was labeled with an address, a date, a name. The names were not names I recognized. They were names that belonged to the specific geography of this corner of Montana, to its courthouse and its county offices and its family dynasties. They were names that appeared on plaques in lobbies and on the sides of buildings and in the newspaper coverage of charitable donations. And behind the blueprints in a different handwriting, not the careful draftsman's script of the drawings, but something more urgent, more compressed, as if written quickly or under pressure, page after page of documentation. Dates, transactions, figures, conversations recorded from memory. 3 decades of crimes built into stone by the hands of the man who had been forced to build them. The last few pages were a map, detailed, annotated, showing the location of a chamber that did not appear on any official plan of any official building, a chamber the map indicated, beneath a warehouse on the eastern edge of a parcel belonging to what the map labeled in my grandfather's handwriting as the Voss family holdings. I closed the notebook. The room was very quiet. The kerosene lamp burned steadily on the desk. The wool blanket was folded on the bed with military precision, and it would never be unfolded by the hands that had folded it, and that fact sat in the room with us, the way certain facts do present heavy, requiring no acknowledgement to be fully felt. "We need to go back to town," I said. Wren nodded. She had been looking at the books on the shelf, reading their spines one by one. She reached out and straightened one that was slightly out of alignment, her finger moving with the care of someone arranging the belongings of a person who can no longer arrange them themselves. We came back down the mountain in the middle of the afternoon, the notebook and the money in my pack, the brass compass in my shirt pocket next to the letter. The sky had cleared while we were underground, and the sun on the open hillside above the tree line was sharp and direct, the mountain air bright with the specific clarity of high altitude and cold. The valley below was a patchwork of brown and dark green, the town of Stone Mill, a small cluster of rooftops at the valley floor. Harlan Wicks was behind the counter when we came in, but this time he did not wait to be asked what he knew. He took one look at our faces, at whatever was written there that we were not aware of, and said nothing for a moment. Then he reached under the counter and turned the small sign in the door window from open to closed. "Come to the back," he said. His back room was a combination of office and storage shelves of inventory along 2 walls and a small table with 4 chairs that served as a workspace. A photograph above the desk showed a younger Harlan in uniform, a fact he did not explain or reference. He poured 2 mugs of coffee without asking and set them on the table and sat down with the careful deliberateness of a man preparing to say something he had been carrying for a long time. "You found the room," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." He looked down at his mug. A muscle worked in his jaw. Outside, a car passed on the main road, its sound fading quickly into the mountain quiet. "I knew your grandfather was alive," Harlan said. "I was the only one. He told me years ago, before he disappeared, he came to me. He told me what he was planning to do and why. He made me promise not to tell anyone, not ever, regardless of what happened. He said that the people he was hiding from had connections everywhere in this county, that anyone who knew where he was became a target. He said the only way to keep everyone safe was to make sure no one knew." Harlan looked up. "I kept that promise for 10 years. I went up to that shed every month, brought him food, lamp oil, things he couldn't get himself without being seen. We would sit in that shed for an hour or two sometimes. Not always talking, sometimes just being in the same room. He was a solitary man by nature, your grandfather. But loneliness and solitude are different things, and he understood the difference better than most." Wren was very still in her chair. "When did he die?" I said. 3 years ago, March. He went peaceful. I don't think he was sick exactly, just worn out. He had finished what he needed to finish. He'd spent a year writing those letters, organizing the room, getting everything in order. He told me once that he wasn't afraid of dying. He said the only thing he was afraid of was dying before you turned 18. He was quiet for a moment. I buried him up on the south slope, marked the spot with a flat stone he'd shaped himself. He picked the spot, said the view of the valley was the thing he was going to miss most about being above ground. The coffee was going cold in front of me, but I had not touched it and did not touch it now. I was thinking about a man who had spent his last years organizing things, arranging the room, writing the letters, making the notebook as complete and clear as he could make it, making sure the door mechanism would hold, keeping the shed lock oiled so it would work after years of mountain weather. He had been preparing for this day for years. He had been preparing for us. "There is something else," Harlan said. He looked uncomfortable in a way he had not looked before, something in his posture, a reluctance that was different from the careful deliberateness of what had come before. Aldrich Voss, I said. Harlan looked at me sharply. He told us in the letter, Wren said, that Aldrich was his friend, that they grew up together. Harlan let out a long breath. He nodded slowly as though acknowledging something he had hoped might be addressed differently. They were more than friends, he said. They were like brothers. Silas and Aldrich, growing up here, I knew them both. 2 years between them, Silas older. They did everything together from the time they could walk. When Silas started learning stonework from his father, he taught Aldrich. Everything Aldrich ever knew about stone your grandfather put in his hands. He was proud of that, Silas was. Proud that he'd passed the skill to someone he loved. Harlan turned his coffee mug in a slow circle. What Silas never knew, what none of us knew until it was too late, was that Aldrich had been building something else entirely. For years, quietly, he had been accumulating influence the way some men accumulate debt, a little at a time, invisible until it's too large to ignore. By the time anyone understood what Aldrich Voss had become, he was already too powerful to challenge through ordinary means. He owned pieces of everything in this county. Judges, sheriffs, the county planning board. He'd been patient about it, methodical. The way you are when you have learned from a craftsman that the thing worth building is the thing that lasts. He used what Silas taught him, Wren said. Yes, Harlan said. He used it all. And when he needed the best stonemason in the region to build the physical architecture of his operation, he went to the one person he knew would do it right. He went to the one person he had by then enough leverage over to ensure compliance. The silence in the back room had a different quality now. I was thinking about my grandfather building things for a man he had once loved the way you love a brother. Moving stone for him, sealing his secrets into the earth, carrying that knowledge alone without being able to tell anyone what it was, for how long it had been going on, what it had cost him. Aldrich Voss had destroyed the person who taught him everything, and he had done it with the specific knowledge of someone who understood exactly what he was taking. We drove back up the mountain in Harlan's truck, a 1994 Ford that ran with the resigned determination of a vehicle that has accepted its life of hard roads and bad weather and chosen to continue anyway. Wren sat in the middle, her shoulder against mine. No one spoke much on the way up. There was a lot to carry, and silence was more suited to the weight of it than words. That afternoon, Floyd Mercer appeared at the clearing's edge. He was in his mid-60s, broad across the shoulders, the kind of man whose size comes from decades of physical work rather than anything deliberate. He had a truck bed full of lumber and a set of tools that had not been bought recently, and he set about assessing the shed's structural condition with the quiet efficiency of someone who has never needed to be asked twice about a job that needs doing. His wife Agnes came with him. She was a small woman with silver hair and a precision to her movements that spoke of someone who had learned long ago to get the maximum result from minimum motion. She looked at Wren, and Wren looked at her, and something passed between them in a frequency I could not quite hear. Your granddad built our hayloft, Floyd said, not looking up from the beam he was examining. Didn't charge us what it was worth, never charged anyone what it was worth, far as I ever saw. He paused. Some things you pay back in kind. He started work without further discussion. By mid-afternoon, 2 more trucks had found their way up the logging trail. Opal Dunst from the diner carrying food in containers that steamed when she opened them. A teenager named Remy Agnes Mercer's great-nephew, who appeared beside Wren, with the diffident but genuine manner of a young person extending an awkward and sincere offer of friendship. They began to talk carefully at first, and then less carefully the way conversations start when they are going to become something real. The people of Stone Mill came because they remembered Silas Carter. They came because Harlan Wicks had made a phone call and said that Silas's grandchildren were on the mountain and needed help, and that was enough. The man had built half the foundations in the county. He had charged what people could afford to pay, and sometimes less. He had been quiet and reliable and fair in a landscape where those qualities were rarer than they should have been, and the people who had known him had not forgotten him even after they were told he had walked away. Perhaps they had not entirely believed it. Perhaps the story had never quite fit the man they thought they knew. We ate that evening on the tailgate of Floyd's truck, the 5 of us, and Harlan and Edna Wicks, who had driven up in their own vehicle when Harlan called her. Edna was a small woman with white hair and a quality of stillness that made you feel calmer simply by proximity. She had brought a thermos of soup, and she poured it for everyone without making a ceremony of it, The way people who are genuinely kind distribute kindness as a matter of course, without performance. I told them what we had found. Not all of it, not the notebook, not the specifics of what Silas had documented, but the room, the letters, what Silas had given up and why. They listened without interrupting. Harlan sat with his arms folded, his jaw tight, looking at the mountain above us. Edna put her hand on Wren's once briefly and then took it back. Prescott Voss will not stop at an offer, Floyd said when I finished. He never has. When he wants something, he finds the pressure point. He applies pressure until something gives. He's going to find out the notebook exists, I said. Floyd and Harlan exchanged a look. He probably already knows something is there, Harlan said. He's been trying to get to it for 3 years, since Silas died. He knows Silas kept records his father told him, I imagine, before Aldrich passed. He knows the records are somewhere on this mountain. He just doesn't know exactly where. And now he knows you've found something, Edna said quietly. He could see it when you wouldn't sell. We were going to need help. Not the kind of help that stands in a clearing with people, though we would need that too. We needed someone who understood the legal architecture of what Blackstone Mining was trying to do, and someone who could take what was in that notebook and do something with it that would last. 2 days later, I drove Harlan's truck into Kalispell and found a law office in a building that looked like it had started as something else and been converted. Corinne Ashby, Property Disputes and Civil Litigation. Her listing was 3 lines in a phone book that was 2 years out of date, which was the best option available to me. Corinne Ashby was 35 years old and built like someone who had decided early that the world was going to require effort and had organized herself accordingly. Wire-rimmed glasses, hair that she had not thought about this morning, or possibly any recent morning, because she had been thinking about other things. She sat across from me and listened to everything I said, without writing anything down and without speaking. And when I was finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she asked 3 questions that were so precise that I understood she had been listening in a way that went several layers deeper than I had realized. She told me what I was facing: the Voss family's reach in the county, the lawyers they kept on retainer, the relationships they had built with the local judicial system over 30 years. Going against Prescott Voss in Ridgecrest County was not a matter of having the right facts on your side. You could have every fact in the world and lose if the wrong people were in the wrong rooms at the wrong times. But she said, the FBI's jurisdiction did not end at county lines. And what your grandfather documented, she said, looking at the notebook I had placed on her desk, is not a local matter. This is federal. This has been federal for 30 years. The reason it hasn't been treated as federal is that no one has ever been able to produce this. She looked up at me. And you still want to fight. I thought about Wren on the mountain. I thought about Silas in his stone room writing letters he could never send, reading the same books until their spines cracked, keeping his tools oiled and his floor level, and his bed made for 10 years of solitary days, while his grandchildren grew up in strangers' houses, believing he had chosen to disappear. I thought about the photograph of a man standing proudly in front of a half-built wall, his hands at rest, his eyes steady, the specific expression of someone who does good work and knows it. Yes, I said, I want to fight. She smiled, then small, genuine, the smile of someone who has been doing difficult work for a long time and occasionally encounters a reason to keep doing it. Then let's talk about what that looks like. Back on the mountain, things had changed in small ways that accumulated. Floyd and Agnes had reinforced the shed walls and rehung the door on new hardware. The roof had been patched where the worst gaps were. There was a generator, now small and loud but functional, running off a gas can that Floyd replenished on his trips up. A pipe from a spring higher up the slope had been rigged to deliver water to a barrel beside the shed. Harlan's work accomplished over a single afternoon with the efficiency of someone who had done similar things in more difficult conditions. Wren was different too. Not in ways she would have acknowledged if asked, but in ways I could see. She and Remy spent long hours walking the mountain's lower slopes, and she came back from those walks having learned things: the names of plants, the locations of views, the specific quality of light at different times of day on the valley below. Remy knew this mountain the way you know a place you have grown up near, with the intimate and largely unself-conscious knowledge of someone who has never needed to think about it consciously. He was sharing that knowledge with Wren the way young people share things of value without making a production of it, without needing acknowledgement, simply because sharing seemed like the natural thing to do. I watched her laugh one afternoon genuinely at something Remy said on their return to the clearing. The sound was so unfamiliar and so right that I had to turn away for a moment to compose myself. Opal Dunce came up most evenings with food, and she stayed while we ate and told stories about Silas. She had a way of telling stories that made the person she was describing present in the room not as a memory, but as a living thing, specific and particular and real. She described the way he ordered his coffee, the way he always held the door for people coming in behind him, the way he had fixed the cracked foundation of her diner building for what she privately believed was about a third of what he actually should have charged, and how she had tried to make up the difference in free pie and coffee for the next 6 months. And he had accepted every piece without comment because he understood that some transactions are not entirely about money. He was the kind of man who made places better just by being in them, she said. We didn't know he was gone when he was gone. We just thought he had left. And the place was worse for it, even if we didn't say so. Wren was listening to every word. She had produced a notebook of her own somewhere along the way, an ordinary composition book from the Stone Mill General Store, and she was writing things in it in her careful, controlled handwriting. Things about Silas, things about the cave, things that I did not ask about because they were hers. The night came down on the mountain 10 days after we had arrived on it, and we had established the beginnings of something, a foothold, an understanding, a small network of people who knew what we knew and had decided that it mattered. Corinne Ashby was in contact with the FBI field office in Missoula. A formal process had been set in motion, slow and bureaucratic, but real. Wren's guardianship hearing had been scheduled 32 days from today in Kalispell. 32 days was survivable. 32 days was a specific and finite number, with a specific and finite end. I had survived longer stretches of uncertainty with less. I was sleeping in the shed that night, Wren beside me, both of us, in the particular deep sleep of people who have been moving and working in cold air for days when the smell reached me first. Not sawdust, not machine oil. Smoke. I was on my feet before I was fully awake, the animal part of the brain that responds to fire performing its function before the rest of consciousness had assembled itself. Wren was awake an instant later. She had always been a light sleeper, lighter than me, the habit of someone who has learned not to be caught completely unguarded. Then we heard it, not inside the shed outside, the particular crackling rush of fire that has found dry wood and committed. I got to the door, pushed it open. The shed was burning from the outside. The far wall and the roof over the workbench had caught first, and the dry gray wood that had weathered decades of mountain winter was burning with a completeness that meant it had been helped, accelerated. The fire was not spreading the way a natural fire spreads, gradually working its way from a point source. It was burning in a pattern. Get out, I said. Now we were out. Standing in the clearing, the night air hit cold against faces that the firelight had made hot. The mountain above us was dark and indifferent. Below us, somewhere on the logging trail, a sound that might have been an engine and might have been the wind moved through the trees and was gone. The fire had the shed fully within a few minutes. There was no stopping it, not with two people, and no water infrastructure beyond the spring barrel, which was on the far side of the structure and inaccessible now. We stood at the safe edge of the clearing and watched the shed burn. Watched the tools go. Watched the workbench. Watched the roof collapse inward in a cascade of sparks that rose and died in the cold air above us. Wren stood with her arms wrapped around herself, her face lit orange by the dying structure. She was not crying. She had not cried since the stone room, since reading the 47 unread letters, each one addressed to both of us, each one a month of Silas Carter's life pressed into paper evidence of a love that had been continuous and specific and entirely without the ability to make itself known. Everything is gone, she said. Her voice was flat. The flatness was worse than almost any other sound she could have made. I stood beside her in the dark, in the firelight, and thought about what was actually gone. The shed was gone. The tools were gone. The workbench that Silas had built to last generations was ash. But the cave entrance was 40 feet away and untouched. The stone door was still sealed. The room was still there, the bed, the books, the desk, the lamp with oil still in it. The notebook was in my pack, which was on my back, which was where I had grabbed it by instinct in the first second of waking. Brecken Voss had come up here in the dark and set fire to what he could reach. He had not known about the door. He had not known about the room. He had not known that the thing he was actually after had been 10 feet underground in total darkness, while he stood above it with an accelerant and a lighter and believed he was destroying something. He had not destroyed anything that mattered. What he had done, the residue his tires had left on the logging trail, the scent of accelerant that was already distinguishable from the natural smoke of burning wood. If you knew what you were smelling, were the witness in the form of a very old man who lived a quarter mile down the valley and kept unusual hours and had been looking out his window at approximately the right time, all of that was still here. All of that was going nowhere. The fire died down as the structure exhausted itself. What was left was a low orange glow in the footprint of where the shed had stood, embers settling into the shape of what had been and would not be again. The stars above us were the same stars they had been before. The mountain was the same mountain. The cave entrance was a dark shape in the rock, a quiet opening, patient and entirely unchanged. Wren looked at the embers for a long time. Then she said quietly, with a steadiness that was not absence of feeling, but something built on top of feeling and stronger than it, "He spent 10 years building something they couldn't burn." "Yes," I said. She looked at the cave entrance. "Then so are we." The embers were still warm when Corinne Ashby's car came up the logging trail at first light. She had driven from Kalispell in the dark, which meant she had left before dawn, which meant someone had called her in the night. Harlan, probably. He had a way of knowing things before they were reported, the quality of a man who had spent 20 years in service learning to read terrain and had never entirely stopped doing it. She stepped out of her car and looked at what was left of the shed. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she walked the perimeter of the burn site slowly, hands in her coat pockets, head slightly forward, taking in the pattern of it, the way the burn was distributed, the way it had started at the far wall and worked inward, the way the accelerant had been applied in a line along the base of the structure rather than at a single point. She turned to me. "Brecken Voss," she said. I told her what we had seen, or rather what we had heard, the engine sound in the trees, the timing, the pattern of the burn. "You didn't see him directly?" "No," she nodded. Her expression was the expression of someone doing arithmetic in their head. 2 FBI agents arrived 40 minutes later. They were from the Missoula field office, both in their late 30s, both with the particular quality of federal agents who have been doing serious work long enough that the seriousness has become structural rather than performed. They photographed the burn site from every angle. They collected samples from the ash at the structure's base, where the accelerant concentration was highest. They walked the logging trail down to where tire marks had pressed into the soft mud. At the edge, photographed those too, and measured the width. The width matched the Voss family vehicle. An older man named Garrett, who kept a small property a quarter mile down the valley and had been a fixture in Stone Mill for 40 years, had been awake at 2 in the morning, insomnia. He said the old man's companion and had seen headlights moving up the logging trail at a time when no one with legitimate business would be moving up a logging trail. He had not thought much of it until the orange glow appeared above the tree line. He had called Harlan. Harlan had called Corinne. The chain of it ran back through the night like a thread through dark cloth. Brecken Voss was arrested at the Kalispell Hotel where he had been staying, the same hotel where his truck, with its distinctive tire profile and traces of accelerant on the wheel well, was parked in the lot. He did not come quietly by the federal agent's brief and neutral account. But he came. I was sitting on the tailgate of Floyd's truck when they told me. The mountain morning was cold and clear. The sky a pale, hard blue that belonged to October. The kind of sky that has no patience for ambiguity. Wren was beside me, her shoulder against mine, a cup of coffee that Edna had brought warming her hands. She did not react visibly when I told her. She looked at the cave entrance across the clearing for a moment, then looked down at her coffee. "Good," she said. That was all. The practical consequences of Brecken's arrest became apparent within 24 hours. Prescott Voss, who had spent 30 years operating in the space between the law's attention and its reach, understood immediately what the arrest meant. His nephew had left physical evidence at a federal crime scene. The FBI agents who had collected that evidence were not county deputies whose attention could be redirected by a phone call to the right person. The wall that Prescott had relied on for 3 decades, the wall built from favors and fear, and the accumulated leverage of knowing where the bodies were buried, sometimes literally, was not positioned to stop what was coming from this direction. He responded the way cornered men with resources respond. he escalated laterally. If he could not stop the federal investigation directly, he could complicate the immediate situation. He could apply pressure to the thing that mattered most to me, which he had correctly identified from the beginning. Wren's guardianship hearing was 29 days away. The document arrived at Corinne's office 3 days after Brecken's arrest. It was filed with the Ridgecrest County Family Court, not the federal system where Prescott's influence had been substantially eroded, but the local system where certain relationships remained intact. It was a petition to have the guardianship hearing suspended pending a psychological evaluation of the proposed guardian. The evaluation had already been conducted, the filing stated. It was attached. Dr. Philip Rourke, MD Psychiatry, a practice in Kalispell. 12 pages of clinical language adding up to a finding that Callum Carter presented with indicators of unstable decision-making, impulsive behavior, and poor risk assessment that rendered him unsuitable as a legal guardian for a minor. Corinne called me on Harlan's store phone. She read me the relevant passages. Her voice was controlled in a way that told me the control was deliberate. "He's never examined you," she said. "This evaluation is fabricated, Doctor." Rourke has a history of providing favorable assessments for the Voss family in various legal proceedings. I found 3 instances going back 8 years. He's their instrument. But the filing is technically valid, and the judge assigned to your hearing has a relationship with Prescott that goes back further than I'd like. What does this mean for the hearing? The hearing is suspended, temporarily. But temporarily has a window, and the window is 72 hours. If we can't produce a substantive challenge to this evaluation within 72 hours, the court will treat the suspension as procedurally justified and reschedule the hearing potentially months out. Months out meant Wren went back into the system. Months out meant everything we had built on this mountain was for nothing, because the one thing I had come here to accomplish, keeping my sister, would be undone by a doctor who had never met me and a judge who owed a favor to the man trying to take our land. I stood in Harlan's back room with the phone in my hand and looked at the wall and let the full weight of it settle. Then I set the phone down and went to find Corinne. The next 72 hours were the most concentrated work of my life. Not physical work, the kind I had been doing on the mountain, which was hard but uncomplicated. This was the work of assembling evidence against the lie in a very short time with very limited resources. Corinne drove back to Kalispell and spent 12 hours pulling records. Dr. Rourke's professional history, his billing records, which were partially accessible through insurance filings, the 3 prior assessments she had identified, the professional complaint that had been filed against him 4 years ago and quietly dismissed. She was building a picture, and the picture that emerged was of a man who had compromised his professional judgment sufficiently and consistently enough that the compromise had become his professional judgment. Harlan made phone calls. He had been in this county for 40 years, and he understood its architecture the way you understand a building you have worked in for a long time, not from the blueprints, but from the use of it, from knowing which doors stuck and which hallways echoed, and where the weight was actually carried. He called people he had not spoken to in years. He asked specific questions and received specific answers, and by the end of the first day, he had established 3 things the judge assigned to our hearing, had received a campaign contribution from a Voss family foundation. 2 years prior, Dr. Rourke had been seen at the Voss property on 2 separate occasions in the past month, and there was a court reporter in the county clerk's office who had been uncomfortable about certain proceedings for a long time and had been waiting without knowing she was waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Wren worked in her own way. She sat at the table in Floyd and Agnes Mercer's kitchen with her composition notebook and wrote for hours the kind of writing that is not literary but evidentiary, a clear sequential account of our time at the group home, our trip to Montana, our interactions with Prescott and Brecken, everything she had observed and could describe with specificity. When she finished, she handed it to me without ceremony, 32 pages in her careful handwriting. "He's never met you," she said. "His report describes someone who doesn't exist. 32 pages of someone who does exist should be worth something." She was right. It was. The affidavit she produced, translated from her composition notebook by Corinne into the appropriate legal format, was specific and detailed and entirely credible. It described observable behaviors, concrete decisions, chronological events. It was not testimony about my character in the abstract. It was evidence. "Mrs. Caldwell flew in from Cincinnati on the second day. I had not asked her to. She had heard from Corinne, who had called her as part of the challenge process, and she had booked a flight without being asked and arrived at the Kalispell airport in the mid-afternoon with a rolling suitcase and the expression of someone who has seen enough of certain situations to know when her presence is not optional. She was my caseworker, she told Corinne, for the past 2 years, which meant she had filed every required assessment of my suitability, my stability, my maturity, my capacity to function independently. Those assessments were on record. They said specific things measured against professional criteria in the professional language that a court would recognize and credit. They said things that were incompatible with Dr. Rourke's 12 pages of fabrication. I watched her sit across from Corinne in the law office and walk through every document with a precision that surprised me. Mrs. Caldwell, who I had always experienced as competent and tired and trying, turned out when she had a reason to try harder than usual to be formidable. She knew the case files, she knew the regulations, she knew exactly which sections of Dr. Rourke's evaluation contradicted not just the record, but the professional standards by which such evaluations are required to be conducted. She looked at me once while Corinne was reviewing something. Her expression was not the professional sympathy I had always associated with her. It was something plainer than that. Something like, I should have done more and I am doing more now, and it is not adequate, but it is what I have. I nodded. She looked back at the papers. On the morning of the 72nd hour, Corinne filed a formal challenge to the evaluation. The challenge cited Dr. Rourke's professional history, the documented relationship between his practice and the Voss family, the physical impossibility of conducting an evaluation without examination, and the provisions of the relevant professional codes that made the evaluation as filed a violation of multiple standards of practice. She also filed simultaneously a recusal motion for the assigned judge, citing the campaign contribution and the existence of documentation that would be introduced at any subsequent proceeding. The recusal motion was granted by noon. A new judge was assigned. The hearing was not rescheduled for months out. The hearing was rescheduled for 4 days later in Kalispell with a judge who had no recorded relationship with the Voss family and who Corinne reported, after a brief research effort, had a professional reputation for being unimpressed by procedural maneuvers designed to substitute for substantive argument. That evening, Floyd Mercer opened a bottle of bourbon he had apparently been saving for an occasion of sufficient weight, and we sat on his porch in the cold and passed it around Floyd and Agnes Harlan and Edna Opal Remy and Wren and me, and watched the stars come out over the valley while the mountain above us held its patience and the cold settled in for the night. Harlan passed the bottle to me and looked at the sky. Your grandfather would have enjoyed this particular evening, he said. I thought about what Silas Carter's particular evening had looked like for 10 years. The stone room, the kerosene lamp, the same 15 books read until their spines cracked. No one to share a bottle with, no porch, no valley view. Just the dark and the quiet and the love he was not able to express to the people it was for. I poured a small amount on the porch railing before I drank any. Wren watched me do it and did not say anything. The courtroom in Kalispell was smaller than I had expected. The kind of courtroom that handles family matters, which are both the smallest and the largest category of legal proceedings, depending on which side of them you are standing on. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights, the smell of institutional cleaner and old carpet that was, in its own way, not entirely unlike the group home. Wren was not allowed in the courtroom during the hearing. That was the rule. She sat in the hallway on a wooden bench with Agnes Mercer beside her, who had driven 3 hours to be there, and Edna Wicks, who had not been asked and had come anyway. When I walked past her on the way into the courtroom, she stood up and put both arms around me, which she had never done before, and held on for a moment. Go, she said. I went. Prescott Voss was not present. His lawyers were 2 of them, which told me something about how the situation had changed in the past week. 3 lawyers would have meant confidence. 1 lawyer would have meant resource constraints. 2 lawyers was a hedging number, the number of a man who was managing multiple simultaneous problems and distributing his resources accordingly. The federal investigation had accelerated in the 4 days since Brecken's arrest. Corinne had been in contact with the FBI agents, and the agents had been in contact with the federal prosecutors in Missoula, and the federal prosecutors had been reviewing what was in Silas Carter's notebook with an attention that the notebook's contents warranted. Subpoenas had been issued. Two of the names in the notebook had already retained their own lawyers, which was the legal system's version of running. Prescott Voss, who had operated for 30 years with the security of a man who believed himself untouchable, was discovering that touchability is not a permanent condition. His lawyers went through their arguments in the measured tones of professionals doing their jobs under circumstances that their client had made more difficult than they needed to be. The psychological evaluation had been withdrawn the previous day. Dr. Rourke, under pressure from his licensing board, which had received a formal complaint, that morning had withdrawn his signature from the document. Without the evaluation, the procedural basis for the suspension was gone. What remained was the substantive question: was I capable of serving as a legal guardian for my 15-year-old sister? Mrs. Caldwell testified for 40 minutes. I sat and listened to her describe me in terms I had never heard applied to myself. Not because they were flattering, they were clinical, measured, specific, but because they were accurate in a way that required someone to have been paying attention. She described decisions I had made in circumstances where the available options were all bad and some were worse. She described my management of my sister's emotional needs across multiple placement transitions. She described the trip to Montana not as impulsive the way Prescott's framing had characterized it, but as a calculated risk taken in full awareness of the downside, which was, she noted, the definition of mature decision-making rather than its absence. Corinne submitted Wren's affidavit. She submitted my financial records from the past 2 weeks, which showed that I had accessed money from a legitimate inheritance, made structured decisions about how to use it, engaged legal counsel, and initiated a process of establishing stable housing, all of which were the specific actions that the guardianship standard required. She submitted a letter from Harlan Wicks, which he had written in longhand on lined paper, in a script that was not elegant, but was entirely legible, describing what he had observed of my conduct over the past 3 weeks. He was not a lawyer, and it was not a legal document, but it was a letter from a 74-year-old man who had lived in this part of Montana for 4 decades and had never, to Corinne's knowledge, written a letter on anyone's behalf before in his life. The judge read it twice. Prescott's lawyers presented their remaining arguments. They were good lawyers, and they did what good lawyers do with weak material. They organized it as well as it could be organized and delivered it with conviction. But weak material, well organized, is still weak material. The judge was a woman in her early 60s with short gray hair and glasses, in the manner of someone who has been doing this work long enough to have developed a very accurate instrument for detecting when a proceeding is about the stated issue and when it is about something else entirely. She had been quiet throughout. She asked 3 questions, all of them directed at Prescott's lawyers, all of them requiring specific answers that the lawyers provided, with the careful imprecision of people providing specific answers to questions they would prefer not to have been asked. Then she was quiet again for a moment. Then she signed the order. I heard it before I processed it, the sound of the pen moving across the paper, the specific quiet finality of an administrative action being completed. Corinne put her hand on my arm briefly and then took it back, professional again, immediately. I walked out of the courtroom into the hallway. Wren was on the bench. She stood up when she saw my face. She read it the way she had always read me, with the accuracy that comes from 12 years of paying close attention to the one person whose moods and signals matter most to your survival. She crossed the hallway in 3 steps and hit me with her full weight, her arms around my neck, her face pressed against my shoulder. I could feel her shaking, the full body tremor of someone who has been very still for a very long time and is only now allowing the stillness to release. Mrs. Caldwell was standing behind her. She was crying, which I had never seen before, and she was making no effort to stop. "We'll never be separated," Wren said into my shoulder. Her voice was muffled and fierce. "Will we?" "Never," I said. "Not ever." Agnes Mercer had her hands pressed together in front of her chin. Edna Wicks looked at the ceiling for a moment with an expression that was its own kind of prayer. The hallway was ordinary and fluorescent lit and smelled like institutional cleaner, and it was in that moment the most important room I had ever stood in. The collapse of Prescott Voss's operation was not a single dramatic event. It was a process, and like most processes, it was partly visible and partly not occurring simultaneously in courtrooms and offices and conference rooms across 2 federal districts. What we saw of it was edited headlines, brief news segments, the word from Corinne that came in periodic calls with updates delivered in the measured tone of someone who has learned not to celebrate prematurely. The FBI team working the case located the hidden chamber from Silas's map on the 8th day after we had turned the notebook over. It was below a warehouse on the eastern edge of the Voss family holdings, accessible through a passage built into the concrete foundation work that bore to the agent's observation the same technical characteristics as the door in Carter's cave. The same precision, the same invisible seams, the same counterbalanced engineering. Silas Carter had built it, and Silas Carter had drawn it. Inside the chamber were 30 years of documents that Marcus Holloway's son had never found, because the man who had built the hiding place had also documented its contents and location before disappearing into a mountain with the only copy. Bank records, communications, documented payments to named individuals in the judicial system, law enforcement, local government. Evidence of 4 deaths that had been ruled accidental by investigators whose impartiality was the documents suggested structurally compromised. The indictments came in November. Prescott Voss on 12 federal counts, fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and 2 counts of accessory after the fact to crimes that had resulted in death. Brecken Voss on 7 counts, including arson, criminal intimidation, and conspiracy. 3 additional individuals whose names had appeared in Silas's notebook on various combinations of charges. Prescott was taken from his home in handcuffs on a Tuesday morning. There was brief news coverage, local television, a wire service item that ran in the state papers. He was 60 years old, and he walked to the federal agent's car with the rigid posture of a man who has decided that this moment will not have the satisfaction of seeing him diminished. And in that decision, he looked more than anything like his father. Like Aldrich Voss, who had spent a lifetime acquiring things that did not belong to him and had died without understanding why they had not made him whole. I watched the brief clip on a laptop at Floyd Mercer's kitchen table. Wren was beside me. She watched it once and then looked out the window at the mountain above us, which was white at the top. Now, first snow of the season up on the ridge, the mountain beginning its winter conversation with the sky. She was wearing a sweater she had bought at the Stone Mill General Store with money from her grandfather's box. It was dark green and slightly too large, and she had pushed the sleeves up, a habit of hers. There was ink on her right hand from the notebook she had been writing in. She had been writing a lot lately. "It's done," she said. "Not entirely," I said. "There will be proceedings for months, I know." She looked back at the screen where the clip had ended and the screen had gone still. "I mean, it's done for us. The thing he had over us. It's done." She was right. That specific weight, the fear of the black SUV, the threat that was always implicit in the Voss family's existence in our lives, was gone. What remained were logistics which were manageable and time which we finally had enough of. The first snow came to the lower slopes of the mountain on the first Saturday of November. Not a serious snow, an inch, maybe 2 enough to change the color of the world, but not enough to change its functionality. We woke to it and stood on the clearing that had been the shed site, now a rectangle of clean white, unmarked by anything, and watched the mountain's familiar shapes become briefly unfamiliar under their new covering. Wren had an idea. She had been having it for a while, she told me, since the first time she had walked through the main chamber of the cave with her flashlight, since she had watched the beam move across the flowstone curtains and the crystal formations, and the 3 pillars that reached down from the ceiling like enormous deliberate fingers. She had been writing it in her composition notebook and working it over in her mind and checking it against the practical realities of our situation, which she had always been better at than I gave her credit for. "Not just a cave," she said, "something people can visit, something they can see. A walking tour," I said. She pulled out the notebook. She had drawn it out. A pathway through the main chamber marked with rope lines to protect the formations. Lighting small, low-impact position to show the formations without overwhelming them. Signs placed at intervals describing the geology, and at the far end, before the stone door, a final sign. About Silas Carter, about what he had built here and why. The stone room would stay exactly as it was. She had thought about that too. Visitors would walk through and see the bed and the desk and the lamp and the books and the shelves. They would read a sign that said a man had lived here for 10 years alone by choice to protect his family. They would walk out into the main chamber with its cathedral ceiling and its impossible beauty, and they would carry both things with them, the smallness of the room and the immensity of what surrounded it, and perhaps they would understand something about proportion and sacrifice, that is hard to understand in the ordinary course of living. We opened Carter's Cavern on a Saturday in late September of the following year. Corinne had helped with the permits, which had been less complicated than expected once Blackstone Mining's claim on the surrounding parcels was unwound as part of the federal proceedings. Floyd and Agnes had helped with the construction of the walkway. Harlan had provided the hardware. Remy had spent 2 weeks helping Wren install the lighting, small solar charged fixtures that had been sourced through a supplier in Missoula, tested repeatedly, repositioned, until Wren was satisfied that they showed the chamber the way it deserved to be shown. The whole town came. They came in small groups across the morning, parking at the bottom of the logging trail, which had been cleared and graded over the summer, accessible now to ordinary vehicles, and walking up in the mountain air that was still warm in the last weeks of September, the aspens beginning their turn to gold on the lower slopes. They came as families and in pairs, and some of them came alone, older people who had known Silas Carter, and whose faces moving through the cave had a quality I had not seen on faces before. A quality of recognition, of confirmation of something finally coming to rest in the place it had always belonged. Opal Dunce walked through twice. The second time, she stopped in front of the sign near the stone door and read it very slowly, and then stood for a moment with her hand pressed flat against the stone wall beside it. Earl Garrett, the old man from the valley floor, who had been awake at 2 in the morning and had called Harlan and set the chain of it in motion, walked through with his hat in his hands and stopped at the photograph of Silas we had mounted at the cave entrance. The photograph from the metal box, the young man standing in front of his half-built wall, the expression of quiet satisfaction on a face that was 30 years younger than the face in any other photograph we had of him. Earl stood there for a while. Then he put his hat back on and kept walking. Mrs. Caldwell came. She had not been invited specifically, we had told her about it, and she had made a decision to drive from Cincinnati to Montana on her own time to be present for it, which told me something about her that I filed away in the category of things I had been slow to understand. She walked through the cave with the deliberateness of someone who is memorizing something, touching nothing, looking at everything. Afterwards, standing in the clearing in the September afternoon light, she looked at me with an expression that was not professional at all. "I should have done more," she said. "Over the years, I should have found a way." "You found a way when it counted," I said. She shook her head slightly, but she accepted it. Wren had designed a small table near the cave entrance. Postcards and a few printed items with the Carter's Cavern name on them, a silhouette of the 3 stone pillars that she had designed herself. At the end of the first day, we counted the money. $320. It was not a fortune. It was a beginning, which is a different and more important category of thing. That evening, after the last visitors had gone and the sun was dropping behind the western ridge and the mountain was settling into its long autumn quiet, Wren disappeared behind the new house for 2 hours. We had built it over the summer with help, with the specific and practical and generous help of people who kept showing up with tools and time and sandwiches on a level section of ground higher up the slope from where the shed had stood. It had windows on the valley side that caught the morning light and held it. It had a porch that faced east. It was not large, but it was solid, and it was ours. When Wren came back, she was carrying something. A piece of wood about 2 feet long and 14 inches wide, a slab of pine that had been left over from the house construction. She had spent 2 hours with a chisel and a gouge that had belonged to Silas Carter. One of 3 tools she had salvaged from the ash of the burned shed, carried down to Floyd's workshop, cleaned and rehardened, and returned to function. She had been teaching herself to carve over the summer, practicing on scrap pieces, filling pages of her notebook with preliminary sketches. The sign she had made read, "The Carter Home, founded by Silas, continued by Callum and Wren." She handed it to me. I turned it over in my hands. The letters were clean and confident, the work of someone who had practiced until the hesitation was gone. The wood still smelled faintly of the gouge's passage through it. "Why the last part?" I said. "Your grandfather's name was enough." She shook her head. "We didn't just inherit this place." She looked at me. "We fought for it. We nearly lost it. We built a house here and opened a cave and stayed on a mountain when every rational argument said to leave." She paused. "That makes it ours in a way that inheriting it alone never would have." She was 18 now, had turned 18 in March, as quietly as I had turned 18, the year before, though this time we had been on our own mountain with our own people, And Opal Dunst had made a cake that could have fed 12 and served it to 11, because that was how many people had found their way to the clearing that evening without being formally invited. She had aged out of the system without the system noticing, particularly because the system had stopped being relevant to her life by then. She was also, without having made any announcement about it, a person. Not a person in formation, not a person whose personhood was contingent on what the next placement would allow a person fully in possession of her own particular qualities and committed to their expression. She wrote constantly. She carved. She drew maps of the cave with notations she was developing into an interpretive guide she intended to publish as a pamphlet by spring. She and Remy walked the mountain on weekend afternoons, and she came back from those walks knowing more about this specific piece of earth than I would ever know, accumulating it the way she accumulated everything systematically with full attention keeping records. She had not stopped crying after the stone room. She cried the way people do when they have learned that crying is not weakness, but information, when they have learned the difference between showing feeling to be exploited and showing feeling because it is true. She cried at things that warranted it and did not cry at things that didn't, and the discernment was its own kind of strength. I hung the sign over the front door that evening. We stood on the porch and looked at it in the last of the light. The next morning, I was up before Ren as I usually was. I made coffee in the kitchen, a real kitchen with a working stove and a window above the sink that looked up toward the ridge, and carried the mug out to the porch and sat in the chair that had become my chair over the course of the summer. A wooden chair that Floyd had declared surplus and delivered without asking, and which had, through repeated contact, shaped itself into the specific attitude of a chair that belongs to a particular person. The valley was spread out below in the early morning quiet. The light was coming in low and orange over the eastern ridge, the long light of October that makes everything specific and deliberate. The aspens on the lower slopes were at full gold. The peaks above the tree line had their permanent snow now white against the pale morning sky. It stretched for miles to the far ridge, to the edge of what I could see farther than I could see. I had looked at this view every morning for months. It was new every time. On the mantle of the stone fireplace, inside the fireplace that Floyd had helped build, and that Harlan had helped line, and that Agnes had stood back and assessed with her hands on her hips until she was satisfied it was plumb, there were photographs. 3 of them in frames that Wren had found at the Stone Mill General Store and considered for an unreasonably long time before selecting. The photograph from the metal box Silas Young in front of his half-built wall. A photograph from the opening day of Carter's Cavern, Wren and I at the cave entrance. The mountain behind us. Wren laughing at something Remy had said a moment before the shutter opened, me looking at her laughing. And the third photograph. I had found it on a Tuesday in early August while Wren and I were preparing the stone room for the cave tour. We had been going through the items on the shelves, cataloging them, discussing which would be displayed and which stored. The album of photographs, the one from the metal box, the stack that had been tied with the gray string, had been the last thing to go through. I had looked at each photograph. Most of them were of places, the mountain in different seasons, the valley below, formations in the cave. A few were of people I did not know. People from Stone Mill who had been part of Silas's life before his life was reduced to what this mountain could contain. And at the very back of the album, tucked behind the last page and held against the back cover by a small piece of tape that had dried and barely held, was a photograph that should not have existed. It had been taken from a distance. The composition was the composition of someone photographing discreetly from a position where they could not be easily noticed. It showed the exterior of a gymnasium that I recognized, the gymnasium of the elementary school, associated with my third foster placement in Cincinnati, Ohio. The photograph showed the front steps and the open doors and the families going in and out on a June afternoon. And in the frame of the doorway, clearly visible, was a boy of 12 in a collared shirt that was slightly too large for him, holding a small piece of paper in both hands. His face was turned toward the camera by accident. He was looking at something to the side, and his face had turned toward the lens without his knowledge. Me, 12 years old, at the end-of-year ceremony where we had received academic recognitions. I had been given one for mathematics. I remembered the paper. I remembered the shirt which had been a hand-me-down from the Caldwell's previous placement, and which I had worn because it was the best thing available, and the occasion seemed to require the best available thing. And in the background of the photograph, outside the gymnasium doors, standing at the far edge of the concrete steps where the crowd thinned out, and the angle of the afternoon light made faces harder to distinguish a man. Tall, in a coat that was ordinary, and not particularly warm for a June day, as though warmth had not been the primary consideration when he put it on. Wearing a hat with a wide brim pulled down slightly, he was looking at the boy in the doorway. At 12-year-old me, receiving a piece of paper for mathematics in a gymnasium in Cincinnati, Ohio, a city 4 states from the mountain, where this photograph had been kept for 6 years. Silas Carter had been there. He had traveled from Montana to Ohio. He had found the address of the school. He had stood at the edge of the crowd far enough back to be unrecognizable, close enough to see. He had watched his grandson accept a small recognition and a modest ceremony in a gymnasium that smelled like gym shoes and floor wax, and then he had gone back to his mountain and his stone room, and he had put the photograph in the back of his album behind the last page held there with a small piece of tape. He had been there. He had chosen the darkness to keep us in the light, but the darkness had not entirely held him. Some part of him had crossed it once, just to be present at one ordinary moment in the life of a boy who did not know anyone was watching. I had sat down on the floor of the stone room when I found it. I had sat there for a long time holding the photograph in the room where this man had lived his solitary life for 10 years, surrounded by the evidence of who he was. The careful tools, the well-read books, the level floor, the bed made with military precision every single morning for 10 years, even when there was no one to see it and no reason to make it other than the fact that it was the right thing to do. Wren had come in and found me there. She had sat down beside me without asking what was wrong, the way she had always been able to sit beside me in the dark, and I had shown her the photograph without saying anything, and she had looked at it for a long time. Then she had put her head on my shoulder, and we had sat in that room, our grandfather's room, the room he had built with his hands in the darkness of a mountain, because there was nowhere else to go, and because going nowhere else was the choice he had made for love, and we had stayed there until the lamp on the desk flickered and we had refilled the oil and stayed longer still. He had loved us. Not in the abstract, not in the philosophical way of someone committed to a principle, in the specific and particular way of someone who got on a bus and traveled 4 states to stand at the edge of a crowd and watch a 12-year-old boy receive a piece of paper for mathematics and then traveled back to his mountain without saying a word and put the photograph in the back of an album and kept it. This was the 3rd photograph on the mantle. This was the one I looked at every morning. The valley stretched below. The light came over the ridge. My coffee grew cold in my hands and I did not notice. A sound from inside Wren moving in the kitchen, the particular sound of her morning routine, unhurried and specific. The smell of coffee being made. In an hour she would be at the cave entrance to meet the group of school children from Missoula who had scheduled a tour 2 weeks ago, and she would walk them through the main chamber with the ease and authority of someone who knows a place completely, and she would tell them about the geology and the formations and the man who had found this place when he had nowhere else to go, and the children would stare up at the ceiling. They could not find with their flashlights, and they would not have words for it, but they would carry it with them. The door behind me opened. Wren came out with her own coffee and settled into the other chair, the chair that had become hers, and looked out at the valley the way she looked at everything, with full attention, taking it in, keeping it. We sat without talking. We were good at that. We had always been good at the specific silence that exists between people who do not need to fill the air between them with sound to know that the other person is there. Below us, Stone Mill was waking up, a plume of smoke from Harlan's chimney. Floyd's truck starting somewhere on the valley road, its engine distinctive at this distance. The ordinary sounds of ordinary morning in a place that had become, without our planning for it, the place we were from. My grandfather had stood on the side of this mountain alone and looked at this valley for 10 years. He had looked at it in every season and in every weather and in the particular quality of light that belonged to each hour of each kind of day. He had known it completely, this valley, this mountain, this sky, in the way you know something you have had nothing else to look at for a long time. He had left it to us, not just the land, the knowledge of it, the relationship with it. The understanding that some things are worth standing on even when everyone is telling you to step off. Especially then. I looked at the photograph through the window. I could see it from where I sat, the 3rd frame on the mantle, a man at the edge of a crowd in Cincinnati watching. I raised my coffee mug very slightly in a gesture too small to need a witness. Thank you, I said, not out loud, just in the way of saying something to someone who cannot hear you, but who you believe, despite everything that argues, otherwise is somehow still paying attention. The morning light moved across the valley. The mountain held its patience. The season was turning the aspens going gold on the lower slopes, the peaks above the tree line white with the first permanent snow. Winter was coming to the Carterland the way it came every year, the way it had been coming since long before any Carter had stood on this mountain and looked out at it. It would come again. We would be here when it did.